Hey, this is Dr. Mort Orman, and today I want to talk to you about camels and stress. Yes, that's right, camels and stress. Now, what in the world could camels possibly have to do with stress? Well, let me tell you. This morning I happened to be listening to a TED Talk. The title of the TED Talk was, "You Have No Idea Where Camels Really Come From." And after listening to this talk, I found out that it was correct. I really didn't have any idea where camels actually come from. The story was built around the work of a paleobiologist who back in 2006, and by the way, paleobiologist just means somebody that studies fossils of dead animals. She was on an expedition at almost at the very North Pole, very high up in the Arctic area of North America and Canada. And she stumbled upon what looked like an innocent piece of wood just lying on the ground. And she picked it up and took it back to her lab and started to try and confirm that it was a piece of wood. And she found out that it really wasn't a piece of wood. It looked more like bone. So she realized she had stumbled onto a fossil of an animal. And so she spent the next 4 years going back to that same location and unearthing another 29 pieces of that same bone, it turned out, and eventually put the picture together and was able to determine through some complex scientific investigations that are described in the TED Talk that this was the bone of a North American camel, that a species that's since gone extinct. Now, what's very interesting is that apparently camels originated in North America. That's where they started. And then they migrated to other parts of the world, and eventually the camels that now live in the desert, in the Sahara, their ancestors came from North America. And the point of the talk, as the presenter mentioned, was it has less to do with what's true about camels as it does about how we function as human beings. You see, everybody had this story up until this researcher stumbled on this piece of wood that camels were evolved in the desert area with all the attributes necessary to survive in the desert, and it was perfectly adapted to that environment, and that's where it must have evolved. And that's the story that we had about the evolution of camels in the Saharan desert. Well, it turns out that with the chance happening of this discovery, it turns out that the evolution that took place in the species of camel to enable it to survive in the desert actually took place in a completely opposite climate, in a climate that was extremely cold. And the similarity between two climates was that the animal had to be able to survive long periods of time without food or water. And so they had to develop the attributes to do that. And it turns out that was originally developed in the Arctic to deal with the winters. And as the camels migrated, it turned out that those same attributes turned out to be very handy in the desert area, but they were not developed in the desert area. That's not how they got started. So the point is that we all had this wonderful story that made lots of sense, that camels evolved in the desert because biologically they adapted to that environment, when in fact that wasn't the truth. The real truth, as revealed by this chance happenstance, was that they developed in an Arctic climate and just so happened, fortunately, had the same attributes that could survive in a desert. So that's why I think it's interesting, and that's the connection to stress, because it turns out a lot of our stress has to do with stories that we've been given, that we tell ourselves every day, ways we think about life, what we think is true about life, what we think is true about stress, what we think is true about ourselves as human beings, and they just aren't true. And when you're walking around with a lot of false or incomplete stories, maybe they're partly true, but they're not completely true, you end up having difficulty navigating your way through life because your stories are off. And you don't have the advantage of that accidental, once in a few years instance where somebody pokes a hole in your story and you realize that it was false all along. But that's what we need to do. In order to really eliminate stress, you have to get good at poking holes in your own stories, the stories you've told yourself, the stories other people have given you and passed on to you for generation after generation. You've got to find out where there are holes in those stories, where they don't match reality, and you've got to do the repair work. You've got to fix those broken stories. So that's one of the things I love doing and working with people. I love being that chance encounter, that when they bump into me by accident somehow, or somehow they get to me, their whole worldview about stress in particular gets blown to smithereens, and they end up with a much better, much more accurate one. So that's how Camels indirectly, and the YouTube video, which I recommend you go watch, has almost everything to do with why we have stress and what we can do about it. Talk to you later.